with line of action, this is the kind of thing where you can start your drawing by just drawing the line and then drawing your pose on top of it. That's one way to do it. It can also be something where you draw your pose and then look at it and go, does this have a clear line of action? And if it doesn't, redraw it and see if you can push it a little more to have something that feels a little more streamlined. All right. Hello, everybody. This is a presentation on posing, how to +1 your poses. The intent of this presentation, one, how can we draw stronger poses? I think for the ADs here, a lot of this is probably going to be going over some of the basics again. But what I find is in our jobs, it can be very easy to kind of, when we have to get something done, get in the weeds of, okay, I'm just drawing, I'm just doing beats, whatever. There's a big difference between doing that and drawing with a more clear intent of like, oh, I really want, this is a character story. I want all these characters to have really strong poses. And when you have that mission in mind, everything's going to be a lot stronger. And this is going to be kind of the tools on how to do that. And for the CDs here, my hope is that this gives a few different terms, helps kind of broaden the vocabulary so it's easier to, if you're looking at a beat or looking at an animation and going, I think something looks a little off about this, but I don't fully know how to explain it. I'm hoping that this presentation can help bridge that communication gap a little bit. Cool. So why posing is important, because you can tell the entire story with a single pose. This is the Norman Rockwell rule. Essentially, you know that it's a strong pose where you look at it and in seconds, you know exactly what a character is feeling, what they're going through. And the Norman Rockwell painting does this perfectly. Like in this eye doctor image on the right side here, like the fact that you have this kid who looks clearly like he's very defiant because of the way he's like sitting up in his chair and his arms are really stiff and his neck, it's all making this one beautiful like line that's pushing outward to show like, yes, I'm ready to get these glasses. Versus the eye doctor who's like a little more, it's a little softer. We have the fingers in the air. It's kind of creating this nice like curve in the pose. Things like that. These are all the kind of choices that are being made to reinforce the emotion of the image. And the number one goal of the pose is clarity. Kind of the nice thing about having a strong pose, especially in our jobs, is we have very limited budgets. We have very limited timelines for animation. And really, you can do a lot of the heavy lifting of storytelling with a good pose. Like if the poses of how the characters are placed in a scene are really strong, you actually don't need tons of animation. The animation can just be used to reinforce what's happening. But if the pose is strong, you're telling that story. All right, so today we are going to talk about these three concepts. We're going to talk about line of action, silhouette, exaggeration, and how all of these, when you are using all of these things at the same time, you've got a great pose. All right, so first up, line of action. So line of action is basically the concept of when you distill a pose into one single line, what is that line? And a more dynamic pose is one that's not just like a perfectly straight, like you don't want a perfectly straight vertical line unless there's a real purpose to that. Like a good pose normally is kind of more at an angle or has like a more clear curve to it. This helps kind of reinforce your poses, gives it a nice like sense of flow and movement. It gives it more of a sense of weight. I love in this example over here how we have in the example of drawing this guy standing, there's the boring version where he's like the perfectly vertical line of action versus if you just give a slight like curve to that line, suddenly he's like resting a little bit on his left leg and suddenly that feels significantly more lively than the one on the left. So that's kind of a subtle version of this versus we have these two, like this bunny and this mouse here, where one's trying to intimidate the other. So by creating that one pose where the line's like really kind of pushing over and like intimidating the other one that's kind of like trying to push away from it. With line of action, this is the kind of thing where you can start your drawing by just drawing the line and then drawing your pose on top of it. That's one way to do it. It can also be something where you draw your pose and then look at it and go, does this have a clear line of action? And if it doesn't, redraw it and see if you can push it a little more to have something that feels a little more streamlined. These are just more Disney examples. Disney's doing this all the time, where you're never seeing Donald Duck perfectly straight like this. They always have a really satisfying line. Another thing about line of action is that line always represents the spine. So it's like the spine plus the head, maybe also the legs. So just having that nice curve there is just making these things feel less stiff. So I did a quick example of taking a pose and thinking of two different lines of actions. So the nice thing about line of action, it's all just about whatever the intent that you want as an artist to make with the drawing. So taking this guy with the sword here, I kind of wanted to try two different versions. One that emphasized the curve of the pose, because there's kind of this natural, like it's already kind of moving in this circular shape with the way his body's positioned. So taking one line that's pushing that to give it like a nice satisfying flow, versus the one on the right, which is kind of pushing the more aggressive feel to it. Like, oh, if this is a guy with a sword, maybe he's like really about to hit something. So like pushing it to make it look like it's kind of really using that force to move in a certain direction. And then the drawings from on top of that, how there's subtle differences here, but you can see how that line kind of helps reinforce the one. You get this nice curve to it. And this one, you get this nice kind of more angular shapes are going to give you a more kind of dynamic, aggressive feel to it versus like a nice softer circular shape. So these are just two examples of that. If you had drawn this pose without considering line of action, it wouldn't have these same kind of nice flowy shapes as basically the learning here. And when we're applying that to our beats, again, reinforcing the idea of think about the emotion, think about the story you're trying to tell before you start drawing the pose, before you consider that line of action. And that's just going to help make that emotion even more clear. So like in showing this kind of emotional scene of this mom and this kid, we've got the sad curve of her body, how that line of action kind of flows throughout her body, like through the neck, through the head. And then the kid's like trying to help out. So he's got this little line that's pointed to her. So having that line that's pointed to her while she's kind of pointed a little more curved, that's also kind of creating a nice flow between the two of them. I took some examples from the Rava video. So this, because of the character designs in this video, it was very, very easy to consider line of action because they're so malleable. So with all of these, like on the left here, these are kind of the more emotional shots, and on the right are kind of examples of using line of action to reinforce movement. So these are kind of the lines that were considered with these. So we've got sad droop like the previous image example. For this guy, because he's supposed to be a little stressed out at his job, this one's supposed to feel a little confined and anxious and squished. So kind of using that as like a squished line of action there for this guy. And then these images where he's kind of lifting the boxes, using the line of action to kind of help show a distribution of weight, show that, okay, we're kind of leaning on this leg. This just creates a much more satisfying pose as opposed to him standing perfectly straight and he's kind of moving his arms out. We don't want it to feel like that. So that, I think that's all the line of action stuff. Oh, no. This is just a slide to show that line of action can be applied to any kind of style that we do here. And just examples of the lines of action in all of these different images. It can be anything from something that's really pushed, like how this guy's body is like super angular, pointed at, he's like pushing a coffee machine here and his body's like completely pointed out. That's really pushed, versus something more subtle, like the fact that all of these scientists here are just slightly leaning towards the left, looking at this computer screen. things like a slight lean like that, that's adding so much more life, so much more. We know what they're looking at because their whole bodies are kind of just slightly pointed at the direction they're supposed to be at versus something that's perfectly straight. Side note, always use reference. This, especially when we're doing those poses that we're constantly drawing things like handshakes. I know this has happened a few times in Make It Better where you have that wonky handshake where you're like, that's not what, just look it up. Just do a quick Google search, use it. Things like holding phones, always kind of, if you don't 100% know what something looks like, either look up a reference or act it out yourself. That can also be a way to kind of figure out the movement of a pose a little easier. All right, big idea number 2, silhouettes. So this is like one of those images that they show you in any character design class. Like the idea that you have created an iconic character when you put them in silhouette and know exactly who they are. So like Mickey Mouse is the number one when it comes to this. There's literally a rule in drawing Mickey Mouse that Disney has where you always have to see the ears always have to be perfect circles no matter what direction he's looking in. And that's to make sure that you always have a very clear silhouette. So this same principle can be used when drawing your poses, and kind of, it's almost like a little test where you could draw the pose and think, okay, if I blacked this out and made it a silhouette, would I still know what's happening with this pose? So example, what's happening here? You can kind of guess, all right, this is somebody standing. Maybe this is an ear, maybe that's a nose, maybe this is hair over here. There's a lot of questions that this pose kind of forces you to ask, versus something like this, where suddenly you have a much more clear, okay, so this is somebody who's holding something, probably a phone. We know where the head is pointed at the phone. We know now where all the limbs are because everything's not totally kind of stuck to the body. This is a much stronger silhouette. So these are the 2 poses next to each other. They're both doing the same thing, but one gives you a much more instant read than the other. So the reasons why this pose on the left isn't as good, you never want, unless there's a reason for it, you don't want all the limbs and everything to kind of be tightly kind of confined to the body. It just gives an overall sense of kind of feeling stiff, claustrophobic. When a character is holding something and it's close to your body, it's just, you're not getting that clear read of what's happening. It's forcing your brain to kind of do a little extra work, versus something like this that feels like you're placing things in a way to where I'm trying to lead the eye to this phone, so I'm going to push it out away from the body, so it's much easier to read. It ends up feeling more natural because there's a little more of a distribution of weight. The legs aren't like perfectly touching each other. No one's actually standing like that. Having the hand rest on the side feels more natural. Considering things like negative space when making a pose. So the fact that there's this little triangle here for the arm that's separated from the body, that's a way to help make it more clear. Like, how do I make sure I can tell that this guy has a right arm? Well, here, if we have this little piece of negative space versus the guy over here, that makes it more clear. Thinking about separating, how can we separate the chin from the shoulders there? That's creating a more clear kind of being able to tell the direction of the head. All things to consider. Okay. Exaggeration. This one's the most fun, and I think could potentially be the one that I'd like to see us as a company just kind of try to push more and more. And it is this idea of, in animation, you can draw things that feel like, okay, I'm taking a pose, I'm drawing it how it would look like in real life. But in animation, a lot of the times that can feel not as fun, a little boring, a little stiff. And all of these images on the left are examples of that. Like, okay, this is these 2 boxers standing next to each other. This looks pretty similar to how it would look in real life. But exaggeration is taking the intent of those poses and pushing it as far as you can push it to make it read as clearly as possible. So with these 2 boxers here, one of them is supposed to be really intimidating and scary, and the other one's afraid and small of the other guy. So taking that pose and having this like beautiful line of action, having him like really lean over the other guy and then really pushing this kind of like squiggly, like confined line here. In real life, nobody's bodies, you never create that beautiful curve. No one, when they're dancing, has this perfectly streamlined line. But in animation, this feels so much more alive. Like when you're looking at these two dancing poses, these two on the right feel like they could dance right off the page. So that's kind of there's always that counterintuitive thing with animation where the more something, as long as it feels right, it doesn't have to actually be natural. It doesn't have to be anatomically correct. If you're capturing that sense of movement, it actually feels more alive than something that is like, okay, we've perfectly traced over this pose from real life.
I don't know if this is like an accurate analogy, but it's like Broadway versus like just film. Like if you're
Yes.
watching like award-winning film, you're gonna get more of like what's on the left, like a subtle pose. But like if you're watching Broadway, it's just gonna be like more dramatic.
Yes. Yeah, because they are playing to the back seats of a theater, they have to push every pose, every
Mhm.
emotion has to be, yes, it is all exaggeration. That's wow, Katie, that's a great example.
Wow!
And you can see in all of these exaggeration when you plus it, when you add with the considering silhouette, considering line of action, that's like the magic sauce of all of these three things working together. Um, so then next idea here is when it comes to exaggeration, it can be helpful to draw multiple poses to kind of help yourself kind of push things a little more. So it's always great to take an exercise where you draw a pose and then do it again with the intent of what am I trying to say with this pose? How can I use everything we've talked about in this presentation to push it even further? This guy here, he's sleeping in this chair. If you want to exaggerate it even more, how do we make it so his body is truly like becoming the chair? How far can things be pushed until you break it? And you won't know the breaking point until you keep redrawing it and then finding, okay, this pose doesn't work anymore. But we rarely hit that. So that's something I would encourage anyone with drawing your characters. Just keep redrawing the same. If you feel like you haven't totally nailed the pose, redraw it again, keep pushing it until you land on something that's a little stronger. Again, exaggeration helps give your poses, it makes them feel a little more alive. When a detective is looking at clues, no one's ever standing there and literally with their hand up like this. But this pose reads, you see that and you're like, yes, she found something and she's excited about it. And it's got that clear line of action. Same with using exaggeration to help like reinforce a movement. Kind of both of these, it's like both for clarity and helping to capture a certain action. This is my Luke slide. I did want to call out because I think that Luke and the way that Luke designs characters is very, very good at kind of naturally creating good exaggeration. I think there is an element of exaggeration where it's kind of turning your design brain on and having that trump anything else. So something like this image over here on the right, that's supposed to feel very harmonious. Everything's in sync. So why would you have elbows then? Why not just have the arms create this beautiful circle that's encompassing the globe, and then the rest of the body's kind of reinforcing that. Beautiful exaggeration, having all these people hugging here become this one nice unit, where all of their heads are kind of confined silhouette wise, they're all confined into one shape that just kind of creates more unity. It's okay to break how bodies are placed. It's okay to break kind of like anatomy and everything if it makes the pose more clear and if it gets the feeling of the pose, makes that more readable. So yeah, that's kind of, you put it all together and you've got strong poses. Here's more examples of things that I just think are solid poses, different examples from our old videos, different styles that are all really clear. Yeah.
All right, let's do an exercise. What you got, Diana?
Sweet. Basically going to do everything that I was using as examples, but got a bunch of poses here. I don't know if we want to take like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but basically take one of these poses, maybe two if you want, and redraw them considering the three things that we talked about, considering line of action, silhouette, exaggeration, and just redraw them as many times as you want, like the same pose over and over again, and see what you can find in how do I take this pose and make it even stronger as like a simple drawing. And I think in some of these, like for instance, the woman looking at her phone here, like the way that they're posed in the reference image maybe isn't as clear, and there's a lot of opportunity to how do we kind of make this even more clear as a drawing.